Should the Baltimore Ravens hire an internal or external candidate for their vacant offensive coordinator position? We talk about that, getting Lamar Jackson some help in Baltimore, and much more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Ravens podcast, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Kevin Ostraker of Ravens Wire. Thank you so much for tuning in today, making us your first listen of the day. We are free and available everywhere on all podcasting platforms, including in video form over on YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First time users can receive on husband and deposit match up to $100 with promo code Locked On. That's PrizePicks.com. Promo code Locked On. We are back here a Thursday edition of Locked On Ravens. Well, of course, plenty to talk about. It's the offseason, but we still have a lot to talk about on the show here. As the Ravens have plenty of storylines. Lamar Jackson, their offensive coordinator position. But I do want to focus in the first segment about one area of that offensive coordinator. Well, I guess it branches off, but the main focus is whether Baltimore should put more focus on hiring an internal candidate or an external candidate and what that ultimate decision should be, whether they make that hire as an internal hire or an external hire. So we'll talk about that in the first segment, candidates on both sides of that spectrum. Then in the second segment, I want to dive into comments that Ray Lewis made about Lamar Jackson and the Ravens' really offensive coordinator situation and in the offensive situation and just getting Lamar Jackson help. So we'll talk about that and how they could actually get him help in the second segment. Then in the final segment, we do have a couple of mailbag questions to get to about Lamar Jackson's contract, about the offensive coordinator situation. So a lot of storylines, a lot to dive into here today. If you do want daily Ravens content, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel on YouTube. You can follow along in audio form too. Same show, both audio and video. We give you Ravens news, analysis, updates, and more 5 days per week, Monday through Friday. So let's talk about the Ravens now. Let's talk about the offensive coordinator situation. For those who don't know, and I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you might know, the Ravens and Greg Roman parted ways last week. And it was a move, again, pretty highly anticipated. It was a move that I personally thought pretty much needed to be made. The relationship stalled out. It grew stale. And after what was such a promising first year as Greg Roman's offensive coordinator, I guess tenure in 2019, that was the start of it all. Historic, right? 14-2, historic rushing offense. They were a top 10 pass unit that year too. Everything went so right for them, at least in the regular season. We're not going to talk about the playoffs, but it just didn't really seem to grow, or at least grow enough after that, where it became kind of the same stagnant stuff. And then issues started to pop up, and those issues wouldn't go away, such as situational awareness, situational play calling, play clock issues, personnel usage. And it went into one huge thing that I just think they couldn't continue down that road. So now they've freed up that position. They can look to kind of reinvent their offense. And that doesn't mean necessarily tear everything down, right? It's not like the Ravens are going to go out there and say, hey, we're starting from absolute scratch. Greg Roman did some good things while he was in Baltimore. And I think, he's one of the better run game coordinator guys in this league, where he can put together a very solid rushing attack. But the thing with Greg Roman, and this dates back to San Francisco and Buffalo, the pass game sometimes is not there. So I don't think the Ravens need to necessarily tear everything down, but they do need to shift. They need to shift away from what the offense was becoming or what it had been already. And so that question becomes now, who is the right person for that job? Well, the Ravens are certainly trying to figure that out, and I hope they do. I hope they make the right hire. But one of the big questions in this is, should they go for an internal guy or an external guy? Now, the Ravens have had a history, especially under John Harbaugh, of going with the internal option. That hasn't been the case always. They have definitely hired from outside of the organization before, but we have seen the internal hires on the offensive side of the ball recently. Greg Roman was an internal hire. He was an offensive guy for the Ravens before being promoted to offensive coordinator. Marty Morningweg was the Ravens quarterback coach before being promoted. Then you have some of the external guys, such as a Mark Trestman, which did not work out, such as a Gary Kubiak. Oh, how I wish the Ravens still had Gary Kubiak. Jim Caldwell was an internal guy. He was an internal hire for them. And what defines an internal hire, obviously, is somebody who is with the organization and then gets promoted from within. That's really what it means. So they could have a very long history outside the organization. If they join the organization and then are promoted, that is technically still an internal hire, to me at least. Maybe someone else has a different definition, but that's what I'm rolling with. External is if you hire them directly from a different organization or a different thing that's not related to the Ravens. So the question with Mike Macdonald was he internal, was he external? Technically, he was external because he was coming directly from Michigan, but he was with the Ravens for like years and years and years. So it was like an internal / external type deal. So now for this position, personally for me, I would like to see an external hire. I just think getting somebody in with new and fresh and innovative ideas, not saying the Ravens don't have that within their building right now, but I think if they can bring in a Zach Robinson, maybe it's Eric Bieniemy, maybe it's Frank Reich, maybe it's Chad O'Shea, one of these guys who we have either heard of, be rumored, or have requested, or the Ravens actually interviewed. I think that would be a good direction to go in. Zach Robinson, former NFL quarterback, is the pass game guy over there in Los Angeles right now. But he's a very hot name, a very hot commodity. The Los Angeles Chargers interviewed him for their offensive coordinator position too. Chad O'Shea, the wide receivers coach / pass game coordinator over there in Cleveland. He's somebody who could be an option, as I talked about. Then I talked about some of those other high-profile names. Jeremy Fowler of ESPN reported Eric Bieniemy and Frank Reich, two guys who I think would be really good in Baltimore. But for Bieniemy, the question is there a lateral move in his interest? And for Frank Reich, could he be hired elsewhere? There's been reported interest from other teams in Frank Reich. Now, the Ravens did interview, according to Jeff Zrebiec, a couple of internal guys in George Godsey, the tight ends coach, and James Urban, the quarterback coach. Godsey actually has play calling experience. He was the offensive coordinator in Houston from 2014 to 2016. I believe the timeline was kind of in that time range. Urban, he was the assistant. He got promoted to assistant offensive coordinator in Philadelphia for a very brief time before going to Cincinnati. He's an Andy Reid guy under the Andy Reid coaching tree. So him and John Harbaugh have ties from that. But I still think that externally, if you're able to bring in new ideas, and then it kind of branches out from there. It's internal versus external, and then it's play caller versus not play caller. Has the guy had play calling experience or has he not? Either way, I think it's fine. I mean, if I had to pick which I'd prefer, maybe with the timeline the Ravens are on, maybe I'd prefer play calling experience, but I'm not too picky. Like if Zach Robinson comes in who has not had play calling experience before, I'd be fine with that. I mean, he has experience actually as an NFL quarterback, so there's different levels to experience in terms of these guys. But I just think that for what the Ravens have shown, you can even talk about the defensive side of the ball and some of the internal hires they've had there. Dean Pease was internal. Don Martindale was internal. And there's the question of Mike Macdonald too. But what do you want the offense to become if you're the Ravens? What kind of ideas do you want to implement? John Harbaugh said that he wanted to keep some of the ideas from his old offense. I don't necessarily think the Ravens changing offensive coordinators automatically says, yeah, we're going to throw the ball 50 times a game. I don't think that's what the Ravens are saying. That they can still be a run-first offense, but the thing is the pass offense has to evolve, and it just didn't do that enough with Greg Roman over the last 3 years of his offensive coordinator tenure. So bringing in that bright, young, innovative mind, and the guy doesn't even have to be like a young mind, but just someone who has fresh and new ideas. I think that would be refreshing for the organization to be able to kind of take what was good from your previous offense, combine that with other ideas from a new offense, maybe from, what do you want it to be, right? Is it pro style? Is it West Coast? Are you running up timing routes? Are you focusing more on the deep passing game? Are you looking at short to intermediate stuff more? And all that also ties in to what your personnel is going to be. The Ravens right now are paying a fullback, a pretty decently sized contract for a fullback. You look at also what they've done in the wide receiver room. You're going to have to figure that out. And as John Harbaugh and Eric DeCosta talked about, that's the room they'll be looking at this offseason, according to them. You have pretty solid tight ends, right? Mark Andrews is one of the best in the league. Good young rookie talent that we saw in Isaiah Likely and Charlie Kohler. Offensive line's in a much better spot than they were this time last year. Running backs, really deep room. But again, the situation also is, what's the situation with Lamar Jackson? Is he going to be back in Baltimore in 2023? There's a lot that goes into that because, if you're the Ravens and you hire an offensive coordinator for an offensive system built around Lamar and then Lamar leaves, it's not great. If you're Lamar and you don't get an offensive coordinator that you want, and the Ravens have said they're communicating with him and he's going to be involved, and hopefully that's not the case. But if they go in a different direction than the coordinator Lamar wants, what does that mean? I don't think they would do that, but you always got to look at the possibility. So for me, I think an external candidate would be better. It's not a slight to George Godsey, a slight to James Urban, not even, even a T. Martin who might get consideration from the Ravens. But if you're able to bring in somebody else, work in those new ideas, I think personally that's the best path for where the Ravens are at this point right now. And that guy can work with John Harbaugh. They can work with the other coaches on the staff to, again, keep the good from the old and bring in some good from the new. So I think it's a good balance. But we're going to dive into more in our second segment, talking about how the Ravens can help Lamar Jackson, and honestly how they need to help Lamar Jackson throughout the course of this 2023 offseason. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a ton to talk about here on the show. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And the NFL playoffs are here. We're really excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the number one sports book in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better. They have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. New customers join today to get started with a $150 in free bets guarantee when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same game parlay. And I'm looking at the FanDuel Sportsbook, and I'm seeing in the NBA, there's so much parity. The Nuggets and Bucks playing yesterday, and the Nuggets' entire rotation was questionable for that game. So we're kind of seeing the money line move, and who's it going to be? Who's going to be favored? And even in the NFL, how much of the Bengals and Chiefs game is impacted by the status of Patrick Mahomes? So there's a lot going on. The Bengals are the favorites right now, at least. So there's so much on the app, and it's on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So football fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets. Win or lose at FanDuel.com/LockedOn. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. We're back here, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher is still here with you. Thank you so much again for making us your first listen of the day here on Locked On Ravens. Be sure to make your second listen Locked On NFL. I host the Monday show over on Locked On NFL, so if you do want more of me, you can go over there and subscribe to that channel as well. But let's now talk about the Ravens and really how they need to help Lamar Jackson. And I'm going to get into this on a bigger scale, like actually dedicate more of a show to it. But I just want to talk about it a little bit in this segment here because Ray Lewis had some comments about the Ravens and Lamar Jackson and the offense in general, Greg Roman. And he said that, they need to get Lamar Jackson some help. And he looked and he talked about the Chiefs, how Patrick Mahomes, he is surrounded by talent there in Kansas City. While in Baltimore, you have Mark Andrews and you have a couple other guys, but he says that they need to give him more, especially when they have as dynamic of a player is that overall. So he also talked about the offense and kind of what it has been for Lamar Jackson over the past couple of seasons. And he said that the Ravens haven't given Lamar Jackson the opportunity to really throw the ball down the field. And he said, let the guy do what he thinks he does very well in that aspect. And I do think Lamar Jackson is an underrated deep ball thrower. Definitely wasn't there over the course of this season. That there's definitely room for improvement. I think there was a regression in that area in 2022. I mean, missed multiple wide open touchdowns. The Bengals game in particular in week 5, he missed, two touchdowns on 3 plays, and they were both wide open guys. So there has to be some improvement there for Lamar, but the offense, I think, wasn't letting him spread his wings totally. And I think if you're the Ravens, you want to put your quarterback in a system that plays to all of his strengths, not just some of them, and then holds the others back. So part of that is the offensive system, right? And we talked about that in the first segment. We've been talking about it really for years now and kind of what we want to see from that offense in terms of the actual system that Lamar has put in. But the other part of that is the fact that the Ravens have not addressed the wide receiver position for years. And this goes back even before Lamar Jackson. They've had trouble developing wide receivers. They have not had talent over the wide receiver position. I mean, you look at guys like Anquan Bolden and Derek Mason and Steve Smith, some of the veterans they brought in from other teams, and the other ones that you can date back, right? There are other quality options that have been there. But for every one of those guys, you have the Michael Crabtrees and the Jeremy Macklins and whoever else you want to put in that conversation. They haven't gotten the more help, though. It's been ever since he's gotten in the league. So in 2018, the offense was again built for Joe Flacco, where they had John Brown that year. They had Crabtree. Willie Snead was brought in as well. 2019, they draft Marquise Brown in the first round. They commit to getting Lamar a top-end wide receiver, at least who they hope would be a top-end wide receiver in that draft. But he's still out there rolling with Willie Snead and Seth Roberts, and they draft Miles Boykin there too. So it's not like, it's not like he has an A.J. Brown or DeAndre Hopkins or a Stephon Diggs. In 2020, it was kind of more of the same where, Brown and Boykin were still there, but they didn't make that acquisition, that big time. And over the course of Lamar's entire career, we've seen Josh Allen get Stephon Diggs. We've seen Kyler Murray get DeAndre Hopkins and Marquise Brown. We've seen Jalen Hurts get A.J. Brown. We've seen these acquisitions, these veteran acquisitions. I'm not saying the Ravens haven't invested draft capital in wide receiver because they absolutely have. It's been there. But they haven't gotten that proven option. 2021, they draft Rashad Bateman. And also 2020, they draft Evan Duvernay, right? So he's in that picture. And then also James Prochet. But 2021, they draft Rashad Bateman. They draft Tylan Wallace. But there's no veteran acquisition. I mean, they get Sammy Watkins, but it's not an A.J. Brown. It's not a DeAndre Hopkins, et cetera, et cetera. 2022, they decide to rely on the young guys. And as I kind of talked about with Bobby Trossett yesterday on the show, I don't think that their philosophy there was misguided because, look, if you're signing veteran stopgaps for 1 year deals and you want to see what your young wide receivers have, at that point, you might just say, let's just give them the playing time and see what they have. Now, I was very adamant that offseason they should have added a veteran wide receiver. Like, they should have gone out there and gotten an A.J. Brown or gotten a Deebo Samuel or a DK Metcalf or somebody like that, and they didn't do it. And I said that, look, they couldn't afford to lose either one of Rashad Bateman or Devin Duvernay, and they lost both of them. And the wide receiver room was just a disaster at the end of the season. So you're consistently putting Lamar in these situations where he doesn't have enough around him from a pass catcher perspective. Mark Andrews is Mark Andrews, and he's great, one of the best tight ends in the league. I think Rashad Bateman has wide receiver one potential, but he's been injured the past 2 seasons, and I'm not labeling him as injury prone yet. If it happens for another season, then sure, maybe we can have that conversation. But it's been 2 years. I'm not going to put that label on him right now. But you need to get Lamar someone else. I think even though Bateman has that wide receiver one potential for sure, as I talked about yesterday, how nice would it be to have him as your wide receiver 2 for a couple years and bring in that pure, no questions asked wide receiver 1, like a DeAndre Hopkins or, less likely options like a DJ Moore, who I don't think Carolina's moving, but someone in that ilk where you can put him on the field with Rashad Bateman, have those guys complement each other, have a Devin Duvernay in there. You can maybe add a draft pick if you want to. I know there's been plenty of conversation about some of the wide receiver prospects in this 2023 draft, of Baltimore having picked 22. But that to me why I think getting a DeAndre Hopkins makes sense. Maybe going out there and getting a Adam Thielen or Brandon Cooks or somebody else, it makes sense for them. And I think this is the year you have, especially now, a lot of it does pertain to will Lamar actually be there in 2023. But even so, they have to figure out the wide receiver room at some point, right? Like it has gone on like this where you have your hits, you have the Masons and the Boldens and the Smith seniors, right? That happens. But I think if you can build a room around Lamar Jackson, if he comes back, if you can have that plus Mark Andrews, plus Isaiah Likely and some of these other guys too, plus you have the dominant rushing attack still with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, it might be tough to maneuver cap-wise. If you look at DeAndre Hopkins, his cap hit is right around $30 million, but it would actually go down to about 19 because that's his base salary. And when a player is traded, it's base salary that counts. But about a $19 million base salary for DeAndre Hopkins. So maybe that has to be restructured. Maybe there's an extension or something that happens. So they'd have to figure out how they would make it work with the cap, especially if you do sign Lamar to a long-term deal or you bring him back on the franchise tag and he plays on it. But they have to put more around Lamar Jackson because they have not done enough around him right now, where he has been having to put the team on his back and carry them. Right now, hasn't been perfect. Right, there are still areas for Lamar to improve, but how much can you ask of somebody who was working with some of the receiving rooms that Lamar has worked with over the course of his career? If you're committing to Lamar Jackson long term, if you're the Ravens, you have to commit to putting the best possible team you can around him, and that includes at wide receiver. Does Baltimore value the wide receiver position? It feels like they don't, just because of their franchise history. But you have to sometimes go away from those values if you know it's going to be for the betterment of the team. And I think for the Ravens, you have to help Lamar out a little bit more. So we'll see what they do. I'm still on the DeAndre Hopkins train. We'll talk more about how the Ravens can help Lamar on a bigger scale. I'll commit, again, more of a show to it instead of a segment. But we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Lamar. There's still plenty of storylines to answer this offseason, but we still have questions to answer, and we'll talk about some of those questions in our final segment, talking about Lamar, talking about the offensive system, and more. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a lot to talk about on the show. We return here. It's our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher is still here with you. Thank you so much again for tuning in here, making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to make your second listen Locked On NFL, where I do host a Monday show. And be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Follow along in audio form. Again, daily Ravens content 5 days per week. But let's talk about some mailbag questions. We'll talk about Lamar. We'll talk about the offense. Our first one coming from Aaron, who says, which candidates are the Ravens really targeting? I feel like half the guys they are interviewing are smoke screens. And yeah, it's an interesting question because, for the Ravens, for their defensive coordinator, they said that they interviewed like 30 candidates for that. Now, how many of those guys are you seriously sitting down and you're saying, yeah, like you're our top choice and we're really interested? I'm sure they actually have interest in everybody they're sitting down and interviewing with. But I feel like, they probably have a list of 5 or 10 guys who they really, really want because, again, there are 10 plus coordinator positions available throughout the NFL right now offensively. And that doesn't really include the opportunities where there's going to be a head coach hired and then other coaching staff changes might happen there. So then that offensive coordinator position opens. So for the Zach Robinsons and some of these other hot candidates right now, Frank Reich, another one of those, can the Ravens only need one of them, but how many of those want to be in Baltimore? How many of those are Baltimore's first choice? How many of those are going to go somewhere else? So there are a lot of moving parts. So, I mean, some of my top choices personally, I think Zach Robinson is one of them for me. I think Eric Bieniemy is another really solid option if he would be willing to make that lateral move. Frank Reich is somebody. I think, Bobby Slowick is someone from San Francisco under that Shanahan tree that you're looking for. And then Robinson obviously comes from the McVay tree. So there are options out there. And I'd say I'm confident that Baltimore could land one of these guys. I'm not saying it's a given, obviously, but they have to get this one right, and they're going to take their time. It feels like they're going to leave no stone unturned. They're going to really try to get into the nitty gritty of things and saying, we're not going to rush this decision. I think that's what they should be saying to themselves right now is if I'm the Ravens, I'm saying we're not going to rush this decision. We're trying to go out there and make the right hire. And I think they're going to do that. So I think if you're talking about how many of these guys are they really, really interested in, I feel like they're interested, but they're probably really high profile targeting like 5 or 10 of them and saying, yeah, these are some of our top choices for the job. Positive Vibes 0611 asks, why are we talking to 10 plus coordinators? Is this just a smoke screen for hiring somebody that's splashy? I don't understand why so many interviews. And yeah, so this kind of goes hand in hand with Aaron's question. And there was a good point made by Spencer on the show on Tuesday that the Ravens, you kind of want to interview some of these guys to maybe just see what their thought process is, kind of see if you can take anything away from what they're saying. So even if you're not actually hiring them for the position, you maybe understand what their thought process is, what the thought process is going on around the league right now, what's in, what's out. So maybe some of these are smoke screens. Again, I'm not saying that the Ravens are super highly, highly interested in every single guy they're interviewing, especially if they're going 30, 40 plus deep into this whole thing. But I do think that there is, they value these guys and they're very smart football minds. I mean, they're in the positions they are for a reason. But then it comes down to kind of what we were talking about in the first segment with, I think the Ravens probably have a couple of checklist boxes where they're saying, we want someone who, either internal or external. What's the type of offense they run? Have they called plays before? So they're probably trying to dip into all of those different pools and get a feel for every one of them. But I feel like every organization has kind of like a initial set feeling on what they want, and that feeling can change, right? If you interview somebody and you really, really click with them, then that could be it, even if it's not necessarily your first choice or your first kind of category that you want that guy to be in. But I think the Ravens still have interest in a lot of guys. It's just a matter of they probably have their top 2 or 3 where they're saying, we really want this guy. We want to see if it's the right fit. Sometimes those guys are the right fit, and you're thinking, yeah, we were right to think this and it could work out the way we envisioned. Sometimes it doesn't go as you envision, and you kind of have to pivot to a plan B or a plan C or even plan D. You can even go all the way down to plan Z if you want to. So that could be the reasoning, but I think that maybe there are smoke screens, maybe they aren't, but we're not going to know until the name is hired. So we can continue to speculate here, but we'll see what happens. And then finally, a question from Herbie_Hind. Will committing to a pro-style offense and bringing in top receivers be enough to convince Lamar to stay with less guaranteed money than the Watson deal? And this is a good question because, again, it kind of shifts to what does Lamar value and what does Lamar want? To me, and to, I guess, a lot of people, it seems like Lamar is really dug in on the guaranteed money thing. And that's what he wants. If that's what he wants, that's what he wants. Where obviously getting him a top flight wide receiver would not hurt, and they should do it. Like, they should get him that wide receiver. And committing to a pro-style offense, if that's what Lamar wants, and he's saying, yeah, I really am confident in my abilities in a pro-style offense, and that's what we should do. If he has that input, I'm sure the Ravens will highly, highly consider it, and they should highly, highly consider it. But in terms of what Lamar's looking for contractually, I don't know if them saying, well, what if we give you the offense you want? What if we give you the wide receivers you want? Would that make you take less guaranteed money? I don't know if Lamar says yes there, because I think that he still wants that. And maybe his asking price comes down. Maybe the Ravens are willing to offer more. That's why this contract it's uncharted territory for the organization, because they've never had to really commit this amount of money to a deal hypothetically. Obviously, it actually has to get done first, but they haven't had to make a deal of this magnitude. I mean, the Flacco extensions were huge, right? But those are nothing compared to what Lamar is going to get from either the Ravens or from a different team. Lamar also obviously does not have an agent. He represents himself in this situation. He has his team. So they're working with that whole situational side of things. But if Lamar wants the guaranteed money, and that's what means the most to him, I'm not sure saying, yeah, we're going to give you the offense you want and give you the receivers you want is going to help him say, yeah, maybe I'll take 20 million less guaranteed or 30 million less guaranteed. Now, should they give him the offense he wants and should they give him the wide receivers? Yeah, I think they should. I think Lamar should feel confident in the offense that he's in, and the Ravens should build the offense around Lamar, and they should get him wide receivers that are able to help him thrive and help him succeed. But it's why the offseason, there's so much to talk about, even though there's no football being played, because it's how much can you commit to the position at wide receiver financially in terms of how much cap space you have, which guy is the best fit for you in that offense. You can't bring in somebody who's not a fit. You need a certain skill set. And if a guy doesn't bring you that, you need to pivot elsewhere. So again, I'm not sure that giving Lamar all these things on top of each other is going to make him say, yeah, I'm going to take half the less guaranteed money than I wanted originally. Maybe it does, but just based off of the fact that the Ravens and Lamar haven't been able to agree to a deal yet, that the guaranteed money's reportedly been the sticking point, I'm not sure that saying, yeah, we'll give you this and we'll give you that in replacement of that guaranteed money is going to have him say, yeah, for sure, I'll do that. But hopefully a deal gets struck. Hopefully we have good news in the coming future for Lamar. But that's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. When we get back in tomorrow, we're rounding out the week. More Ravens talk here on Locked On Ravens. So be sure to stay tuned for that. And I will see you right back here tomorrow.